Hello everybody, and welcome to my War Thunder Ground Forces Tips and Tricks series. Today we will be exploring ammunition. There are three main types of ammunition that are used in this game: AP, HE, and Heat. AP, or armor piercing, has many variants: regular AP, AP HE, AP HEBC, AP CBC, AP CR, AP DS, etc., etc., etc. All these different types do a bunch of different things. What you're really looking for in AP shells is either a max damage with a medium penetration or a low damage with a really high penetration. Some shells give you an in-between look, other shells don't really get one or the other, but AP shells should be your bread and butter for your tank. There are some exceptions obviously, but for the most part AP shells are the best shells you can get. Let's look at the Tiger II, and as you can see here, it gets an AP CBC, an AP CR, a heat shell, and an HE shell. Now the AP shells are these first two. The AP CBC is a armor piercing cap, ballistic cap shell. What this means is that it's an armor piercing, which means it's for anti-tank use. The C in the middle is capped, which means that it has an explosive in it. In this case, it's the H10, as we can see down in the stats view, and it has a decent amount of explosive mass. And what this means is that when it penetrates a tank, it will blow up inside the tank, dealing lots of damage and giving it a very good chance to one-shot enemy tanks. AP HEBC and AP CBC are the best rounds for taking out tanks in one shot. They by far do the best at, in this game, dealing the maximum amount of damage in one shot. Then we have the APCR, which is an armor piercing composite rigid shell. These ones are essentially, the round itself is smaller than 88. It's probably firing, I don't know, like an 83 millimeter shell, let's say. I don't know. I don't honestly know the size of it, but it's a smaller shell that basically travels much faster. And because of this, as we can see the penetration values between the two, it penetrates nearly 50 more millimeters of armor. However, because it weighs 3 kilograms less, it does a lot less damage, and it doesn't have an explosive center, so when it does penetrate, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage. APCR shells and APDS shells, which are armor piercing discarding sabot shells, are almost the same, and they do very good at penetrating heavy armor and hitting things right behind that armor. So let's say you penetrate the side of a tank, and right beside that tank, right where that penetrates, is the driver or the gunner or the commander. It will kill that, and it will kill anything in a straight line behind it. Armor piercing discarding sabot shells actually do a better job at this because they tend to do more damage after they penetrate a tank than the APCR does. Some of the other types of AP shells that there are, look at the T-34s for this. We have your AP HEBC, which works very similar to an AP CBC in that it will penetrate and blow up inside the tank. We have an AP BC, which is different than an AP CBC because the BC at the end just means ballistic capped. That just means that the tip of the round is pointed to fly better, and it will therefore have better flight characteristics, be more accurate, fly faster than if it just had a blunt nose. However, blunt nose rounds actually do better with penetration because when they hit, they will do what's called normalize. And I'll talk about that when we talk about armor, but basically just know that APBC is not the same as APCBC or AP HEBC. Basically, this is a standard AP round, and it does moderate amount of damage with a decent armor piercing value. And again, an APHE. One of the other ones that we can look at, the Americans have them, is just a standard AP round. Right here, armor piercing shell. Nothing special, literally just a hunk of lead. And that's for the most part your armor-piercing rounds. I'll show you discarding Sabo one on the T10M, because I know that one has it. Discard or APDS, discarding Sabo. Basically, it fires a subcaliber round that does a lot of damage, with a lot of penetration, obviously. Discarding Sabo rounds are really good because they go really fast and they're really accurate. They are awesome in simulator battles. I love sniping with them because they do a pretty good amount of damage, but they also are very accurate. Again, if you are looking for a round and you have no idea what to choose for a round, first thing you want to look for is an APHE or an APC BC. And when you're looking for a round, if you're unsure whether or not it has that explosive cap in it, you can look at a round and see that it will have an explosive type and an explosive mass inside of the stats of the actual round. That's what you're looking for, because that means that when it penetrates, it will blow up inside the tank, dealing maximum damage. These AP shells are by far the best shells in the game. I would suggest you find one and use it. It usually doesn't have the best penetration on a tank, but it will also usually do very good as far as taking out tanks if you can penetrate them. And learning how to penetrate tanks with that type of shell is a must, because that's the best way to one-shot and take out tanks very quickly. The next type of shell there is HE, and the best way to show HE shells is with a KV2. Because the KV2, right here, KV2 has a 152 millimeter gun. Basically, HE shells are either tank specific or they need a really big gun, and by that I mean 122 millimeter or bigger. You can see the size of a tank gun over here, right above the armor and X-ray thing. It'll be the main gun. Basically, these HE shells don't do a whole lot of penetration. At tier 3, 75 millimeters penetration is not a whole lot. However, as we can see over to the side, the projectile has a mass of 40 kilograms with an explosive max of almost 7 kilograms. This means that it has 7 kilograms of TNT packed inside of that round. It's going to do some damage. The big caliber weapons can one-shot tanks without even penetrating them using HE shells. A lot of tanks with shot traps, which I talked about in my tank anatomy video, shooting a shot trap with an HE shell is actually a very effective way of killing a tank. And in fact, with a tank like an IS-4 or an IS-3, commonly, if I'm struggling taking out an enemy IS-4 or an enemy IS-3, I have a couple of HE shells loaded that I can just plant right here, right below the gun mallet. It'll explode and explode down inside the tank. Lastly, we have heat shells. Low-tier heat shells are not very effective. Even looking at the Tiger II, with its heat shell, it only has 110 penetration, which is not very good for an 88 millimeter gun. Especially considering our APC BC round does 235 millimeters penetration, and our HE round only does 16, I guess, but our HE round is almost better off than the heat. Heat rounds act a lot like a AP round. Once they penetrate, they will do a lot of directional damage, but they do a little bit more. They have a little bit more fragment, but the cone of fragmentation is a little bit smaller. What I mean by that is that a regular AP shell, not one with a high explosive cap in it, will penetrate and do a lot of spalling and a lot of penetration damage in a large cone across the tank, but it doesn't go very far into the tank. So let's say you penetrate the front plate, you might not hit anything past about right here in the tank. With a heat shell, it will penetrate right here, but it'll shoot a cone that goes out really far into the tank, but doesn't hit maybe the driver or the machine gunner. It just hits the stuff in the middle. However, as heat shells get better, when we look at the top tier heat shells, such as the one in the T10M, the fin stabilized ones, they get a lot of penetration and they do a lot of damage. These fin stabilized heat shells are probably the best shells in the game, doing a lot of damage and having a ridiculous amount of penetration. They are the only exception to the AP-HE rule, and if you have these heat shells, I would highly suggest you use those. In my T10M, because its AP-HE shell, its standard shell, is actually so good at penetrating armor, I do carry about a 50-50 split between the AP and the heat shell with the fin stabilized, but I usually end up using the fin stabilized quite a bit more than I do the AP shells. Howdy y'all, let's look at what AP does to a tank. Now this is an armor-piercing ballistic cap shell. Looking up in the armor upper right, we can see that Russian tanks are really good. Looking up in the upper right, we can see that it went into there, and then once it got inside, it exploded, killing all the crew. That's what an AP-HE shell does, is it will penetrate a tank and then blow up inside. Let's try it again against this T-44 over here. As you can see, it penetrated and then blew up inside the tank, killing all the crew. Now let's look at APCR. APCR does not do a whole lot of damage to stuff that's not right behind it. As we can see, we only killed 2 crew members. With an AP-BC shell, that might have actually killed the tank. It doesn't, because it doesn't do very much damage to stuff that isn't right behind the gun. That bounced. Russian tanks are really good. Trying to pinpoint parts of the tank to shoot is what this shell is really good at. Let's say you really wanted to shoot that fuel tank way in the back. That's what this round is really good at doing. Or you need to kill the gunner or whatever. So you shoot the tank right where the gunner sits to kill the gunner immediately. That way you can follow up with maybe an AP-BC shell to kill the tank. Next, we have the armor-piercing discarding sabot round. As we can see, it did a whole lot of damage and actually did a decent cone of fire as compared to the APCR round. Where the APCR round only really killed the stuff right behind it, the APDS round actually killed a lot of things inside the tank that were not only just behind it, but next to it as well. So again, shown there by all the stuff behind it killed around it. Now, let's look at a high explosive shell from a really big tank gun. As we can see, we didn't really do much because we're aiming at a pretty heavily armored part of the tank that was sloped back. When shooting these types of guns, it's best to find a flat part of the tank to shoot at, or to get around to the sides or rear, because these HE guns really only do their maximum amount of damage if it's flat, because all the energy will go towards the thing instead of up and out, kind of. It's hard to explain without pictograms, but basically try and shoot at flat points or to the sides and rear tanks because it's usually thinner. As you can see there, finding a flat point, boom, no turret. Is it still in the air? Or did it fall? Oh, Jesus, I have no idea where the turret went. Here we have the heat shell in action. Doing a lot of damage and firing pretty much straight through a tank. There we go again. See, it just does a lot of damage firing straight through a tank. Now let's see what a heat fin stabilized shell can do. As we can see, it killed everybody in a line right there without even like a problem. That's what this shell is really good at. It's just taking out a shit ton of crew in one shot. It doesn't really have much of an issue against sloped armor. It can go pretty much straight through it. It's a really good anti-tank shell, and if you happen to have a tank that utilizes it, I would highly suggest you use it, because it has a stupidly high amount of penetration, and it's just a really good tank shell. See there, we killed a bunch of crew and detonated the ammo rack.